Beckett Langston's heart betrayed him in the quietest room he'd ever known. Its faltering beat a traitor's whisper that no empire could silence. Hi family, I need you to help subscribe to this channel to help us grow, and to help us give you more interesting stories. Thank you. Now let's continue. The private wing of the Langston Institute for Medical Research exhaled a sterile hush, its machines humming a low, relentless hymn that fused with the silence. Tucked on the edge of a decaying industrial town, this was his hidden refuge, funded through veiled trusts and shadow accounts that led only to him. No one, not his boardroom allies, not the lieutenants of his energy firms or shipping fleets, not even the scattered Langston kin, knew of his hand in this place. Here, he had funneled millions to outrace the diseases that stole his parents, believing science could defy the inevitable. Now, the inevitable stared back through Dr. Elias Crow's tired eyes, delivering a verdict that no wealth could overturn. Beckett sat in a cracked leather chair, its creak under his weight the only sound louder than his pulse. The room was bare, white walls, a few anatomical sketches of hearts branching like rivers he couldn't cross, a narrow window framing a gray sky where autumn leaves clung to barren trees. He'd driven here alone, as always, in a nondescript sedan, the engine's drone his only companion on the twisting road from the city. No chauffeurs, no entourage. Just him and the secret he'd carried for decades. Dr. Crow stood opposite, hands clasped, his lab coat creased from a night that bled into dawn. His eyes, framed by thin glasses, held a pity that stung like a blade. "Mr. Langston," he said, voice steady but frayed, "the tests are clear. Your heart cardiomyopathy advanced. We can't reverse it. A year, maybe 6 months if we're generous." The words fell like ash, silent but searing. Beckett didn't move. He'd built an empire on audacity. Energy firms powering nations, shipping lanes slicing oceans, islands bought not for leisure but for their silent strategic value. He'd bent markets, outmaneuvered rivals, stretched days into nights to secure his legacy. Yet in this antiseptic room, reeking faintly of coffee and disinfectant, his victories crumbled. Time, the one force he'd always outrun, had caught him, its grip cold and final. His neck pulsed, erratic, each beat a taunt. How many mornings had that rhythm carried him, waking before dawn to chart acquisitions, to conquer. His life was a fortress of triumphs, each deal a stone to wall off the fragility he despised in others. Now the fortress cracked. The doctor waited, the silence heavy, broken only by a distant monitor's beep, a metronome to his unraveling. Memories crept in, uninvited. 20 years ago, his father's funeral. A rain-soaked cemetery, the old man's heart stopping mid-sentence over dinner. Beckett, 30 then, already richer than his inheritance, felt the loss like a knife. 2 years later, his mother followed, her blood disorder claiming her in a bed like this one. That pain had birthed this institute, his millions flowing silently to chase cures. No plaques or press to mark his name, just anonymous hope. Now the cruel twist. His own creation couldn't save him. "Questions?" Dr. Crow asked, easing onto a stool, his gaze level, as if to soften the abyss between them. Beckett's eyes drifted to the window. A groundskeeper outside raked leaves, the metal scrape faint through the glass. Questions? What could he ask that wouldn't bear the terror clawing inside? He thought of his islands. Maine's rocky shores, the Pacific's lonely cliffs. Lands he'd meant to shape into something enduring. For whom? No wife, no heirs. His loves had been brief casualties of ambition. Elena, years back, her laughter warm as sunlight, had wanted more. A life beyond his endless work. He'd let her slip away, choosing power over her. Regret burned now, sharp and useless. Dr. Crow nodded at the silence. "We'll talk options, palliative care, maybe trials here. You've given us so much, Mr. Langston. If there's anything..." Beckett raised a hand, weary. "Later." His voice cracked, raw with a vulnerability he hated. He stood, chest aching, his body a traitor. The room closed in, air thick with the weight of truth. As the doctor left to fetch pamphlets. End-of-life plans, support resources. Beckett pressed a hand to the window, its chill seeping into his palm, fogging with his breath. The groundskeeper paused, leaning on his rake, staring at the horizon. Beckett envied that fleeting stillness, unburdened by a ticking heart. His mind churned. The firms he'd seized, the routes he'd mapped, all veins in a world he'd mastered. What did mastery mean when the master broke? A memory struck, vivid and cruel. The family home in the hills, his grandfather teaching him to fish. "Time's the river you can't dam," the old man said, reeling in a trout that thrashed on the bank. Young Beckett had laughed, fearless. Now those words haunted. He'd dammed rivers for power plants, lit cities with his will. But this river, carrying him to an uncharted end, flowed free. Dr. Crow returned, papers in hand. Beckett took them, their weight nothing against the heaviness in his soul. They spoke briefly, appointments, medications, but his thoughts drifted, lost in the void of what came next. Regret shadowed him, for love's lost, moments traded, peace ignored until too late. The corridor echoed as he left, his steps alone. The institute buzzed on, researchers chasing breakthroughs for others. For Beckett, the world shrank to his faltering heart, each beat a countdown. Outside, autumn's bite carried earth and decay. His car waited, keys a false anchor of normalcy. Driving off, the institute fading in the mirror, isolation crushed him. His wealth, his fleets, his quiet charity. None could reclaim the time he'd spent. Alone on the road, dusk cloaking him, he knew. He was heir to nothing but his own undoing, rich in all but redemption. The car's silence roared, pierced by the engine and his uneven pulse. It was finality's sound. A life counted not in empires but in heartbeats missed. Beckett gripped the wheel, the road blurring through tears he couldn't shed, aware the true journey lay ahead. Not conquest, but the reckoning of a man, frail and fleeting, in a world that turned without pause. The engine's hum faded as Beckett Langston killed the ignition, leaving only the faint, irregular thud of his heart to fill the silence. He sat motionless in the driver's seat, the sedan parked crookedly on the institute's gravel lot, its tires crunching leaves that had fallen in his absence. Outside, the world looked muted, autumn's gray sky pressing down on skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the air like unanswered prayers. The Langston Institute loomed behind him, its brick facade shrinking in the rearview mirror, but he didn't turn the key again. Not yet. His hands rested on the wheel, knuckles pale, as if letting go might unravel him entirely. In his pocket, his phone buzzed once, a notification he ignored. Instead, his fingers drifted to its screen, unlocking it with a swipe that felt heavier than it should. There, buried in a folder labeled only miscellaneous, was a photo he hadn't opened in years but could never delete. Sloane Whitmore, mid-laugh, her dark hair catching the wind on a cliffside trail they'd hiked a lifetime ago. Her eyes, bright with a joy he'd once sparked, stared back at him now, accusing and forgiving in equal measure. He lingered on the image, thumb hovering, then locked the phone and shoved it away, the gesture sharp, like slamming a door on a memory too raw to touch. The drive to his countryside estate was a blur of winding roads and dying light. The city's clamor had long faded, replaced by fields that stretched into shadow, their edges softened by mist. He kept the radio off, letting the silence press against him, heavy with the doctor's words. 6 months, maybe less. His mind didn't drift to the boardrooms or the contracts piling up on his desk. Instead, it clung to Sloane, her absence a weight that had grown heavier with every mile. He saw her in fragments. The way she'd tilt her head when she listened, the soft cadence of her voice reading poetry aloud, the warmth of her hand in his before he'd chosen ambition over her. The estate emerged from the dusk, a stone manor nestled in a valley where the world seemed to hold its breath. No gates, no guards, just acres of quiet, the kind that swallowed sound and left only echoes. He parked near the front steps, the gravel crunching underfoot as he stepped out, the air sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The house was old, inherited from his grandfather, its walls weathered but unyielding, like the man who'd raised him. Inside, the air was cool, thick with the must of old books and the faint ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. The lights stayed off. The dim glow from the windows was enough, casting long shadows across oak floors worn smooth by decades. Beckett moved slowly, his coat still on, as if he might flee at any moment. The living room was a museum of his solitude. Shelves lined with leather-bound volumes he hadn't touched in years, a fireplace cold with ash, a single armchair facing a window that overlooked nothing but darkness now. On the desk, cluttered with papers he'd ignored for months, sat the photo. Not a digital ghost like the one on his phone, but a physical print, its edges curling slightly from time. Sloane, again, this time in a faded frame, her smile frozen in a moment he'd let slip away. He didn't pick it up, but his fingers grazed its edge, the wood cool against his skin. She'd been a curator at a small museum, her world one of artifacts and stories, not profits and power. They'd met by chance, at an auction where he'd bid on a painting to secure a client's favor. Sloane had been there, annotating a catalog with a pencil stub, her focus so intense it drew him in. They'd talked for hours that night, not about business but about the lives behind the art, her passion for the human stories woven into every brushstroke. He'd fallen for her then, hard and fast, her warmth thawing the edges of his guarded heart. For a year, they'd been inseparable, hikes along coastal trails, evenings in her cluttered apartment, her reading aloud from books he'd never heard of. She'd made him feel human, not a machine of ambition. But ambition had won. A deal in Singapore, a merger that demanded his focus, a chance to cement the Langston name across continents. He'd told her it was temporary, that he'd be back, that they'd build something real. She'd smiled, sad and knowing, and said, "You're chasing a shadow, Beck. It'll never hold you." He'd left anyway, promising calls that grew sporadic, then stopped. When she stopped waiting, he didn't fight for her. The empire grew, but the hollow in him deepened. And now, with his heart's betrayal, her absence was a wound that bled anew. He sank into the armchair, the leather creaking under him. The clock ticked on, each second a reminder of the countdown he couldn't escape. His phone sat on the desk, next to the photo, its screen dark but tempting. He opened it again, drafting a message. "Sloane, I know it's been years, but I need to." His thumb paused, then deleted the words, letter by letter, until the screen was blank again. What could he say that wouldn't sound like desperation, like a man grasping at ghosts? He set the phone down, his hand trembling slightly, and stared at the photo instead. Her eyes seemed to follow him, not accusing now but searching, as if asking what he'd become. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that amplified every thought. He rose, restless, and wandered to the bookshelf, pulling out a volume at random, a collection of poetry Sloane had once loved. He flipped it open, and a folded letter slipped out, its creases soft from years of handling. Her handwriting, neat and slanted, stared back at him. "Beck, you'll read this when you're ready to stop running. I hope it's not too late." She'd written it the day she left, slipping it into the book he'd never returned. He hadn't read it then, too consumed by the next deal, the next victory. Now he unfolded it, but the words blurred, his eyes stinging with something he refused to name. He remembered her apartment, the way it smelled of coffee and old paper, the way she'd laugh at his attempts to recite her favorite poems. He'd been softer then, or at least closer to it, before the world hardened him into someone who owned islands but not peace. The letter trembled in his hands, but he didn't read it. Not yet. Instead, he tucked it back into the book, his fingers lingering on the spine, as if touching it could bring her closer. Outside, the wind stirred, rattling the windows. He crossed to one, looking out at the dark fields, the stars hidden by clouds. The estate felt like a tomb, its stillness a mirror to his own. He'd built an empire to outlast him, but what was legacy without someone to share it? Sloane's face lingered in his mind, not the photo but the memory. Her standing on that cliffside, wind in her hair, daring him to live for something more than power. He'd failed her then and himself, He returned to the desk, the photo drawing him like a beacon. His fingers closed around his phone, not to text but to search. An impulse he didn't question. Her name typed itself into the search bar, but he stopped short of hitting enter. Not yet. He needed to see her, to say what he'd left unsaid, to ask if redemption was possible for a man who'd traded love for a throne. The decision settled in him, unspoken but solid, like a stone dropped into deep water. He would find her, not tonight, but soon, before the river of time carried him too far. The clock ticked on, its rhythm a faint echo of his own faltering heart. Beckett stood alone in the house that held his past, the photo of Sloane glowing faintly in the dim light, a silent promise that he'd chase one last thing. Not power, but the chance to make right what he'd broken. The grandfather clock in Beckett Langston's study ticked on, its pendulum slicing through the stillness, each swing a reminder of the heartbeats he could no longer trust. He stood by the desk, the photo of Sloane Whitmore glowing faintly under the lamp's muted light, her frozen smile a tether to a life he'd abandoned. His phone lay beside it, her name typed into the search bar, the cursor blinking like a pulse he couldn't steady. His thumb hovered over the call button, the weight of years pressing against the simple act. Calling felt too abrupt, too raw, like shouting into a void that might not answer. Instead, he reached for a pen, the kind his grandfather had used, heavy and cold in his hand. A letter, he thought. Something deliberate, something she could hold or burn as she chose. He sat, the chair creaking under him, and pulled a sheet of cream stationery from the drawer. The paper smelled faintly of dust, untouched since he'd moved into this house years ago. His hand shook as he began, the ink smudging slightly under his grip. "Dear Sloane," he wrote, then paused, the words catching in his throat as if spoken aloud. "I've spent a lifetime building things that don't matter now. I'm unwell and I need to see you, not to fix what I broke, but to say what I couldn't then." He stopped, rereading the lines, the honesty stinging like a fresh cut. He added an invitation, simple, unadorned, to come to the estate to talk if she'd allow it. He sealed the envelope, her name written in his careful script, and entrusted it to a courier before doubt could pull him back. The act felt final, like dropping a stone into a river, uncertain if it would ripple or sink. Miles away, in a small coastal town where the sea whispered against rocky shores, Sloane Whitmore received the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped through the mail slot of her modest cottage, its whitewashed walls warmed by the glow of a wood stove. She was 42 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, pulled back in a loose braid as she sorted through invoices for her bookshop. The envelope stood out among the bills, its heavy paper and unfamiliar handwriting stopping her mid-motion. She recognized it instantly, Beckett's precise, slanted script, unchanged by time. Her breath caught, a flicker of the old ache stirring beneath her calm. She opened it slowly, the paper tearing with a soft rasp. The words blurred at first, her eyes skimming his confession, his invitation. Unwell. The word lodged in her chest, sharp and unwelcome. She set the letter down on her kitchen table, next to a mug of tea gone cold, and stared out the window at the gray waves rolling in. Sloane's life was quiet now, deliberate. A bookshop filled with poetry and history, evenings spent with friends who knew her as she was, not as the woman who'd once loved a man too consumed by ambition to stay. But Beckett's shadow lingered, in the way she'd pause at certain poems, in the way she'd never quite trusted love again. Resentment simmered, tangled with curiosity and a grief she hadn't named until now. She didn't reply immediately. For 2 days, the letter sat on her table, its presence like a ghost she couldn't ignore. She traced its edges during sleepless nights, remembering his voice, his rare laughter, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered, until she wasn't. Part of her wanted to tear it up, to let him face his regrets alone. But another part, quieter, wondered what he'd become, what illness had stripped from him. On the 3rd day, she wrote a response, brief, guarded. "I'll come. One conversation, that's all." She mailed it before she could reconsider, her heart pounding as the postbox clanged shut. The meeting was set for a Saturday, at his estate. Sloane drove herself, the coastal road giving way to inland fields, their golden hues dulled by autumn's fade. The manor appeared as she remembered it from a single visit years ago. Stone walls rising from the earth, windows like unblinking eyes. She parked beside his sedan, its plainness surprising her. A far cry from the man who'd once owned the world. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of pine and wet leaves, and she hesitated at the door, her scarf tightening around her neck like a shield. Beckett opened the door himself, no staff to buffer the moment. He was thinner than she remembered, his face pale, the lines around his eyes deeper, as if time had carved its own map across him. His suit was simple, dark, the kind a man might wear to a meeting he couldn't prepare for. His eyes met hers, steady but fragile, like glass holding back a storm. "Sloane," he said, his voice low, trembling beneath its control. "Thank you for coming." She nodded, stepping inside, her boots echoing on the oak floor. The sitting room was spare, its muted greens and grays lit by a single lamp and the weak daylight filtering through tall windows. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to warm the space. They sat across from each other, she in an armchair, he on a worn sofa, the distance between them a chasm of years. The grandfather clock ticked in the hall, its rhythm uneven, or perhaps that was her imagination, projecting his fragility onto the world. He didn't waste time. His hands clasped tightly in his lap, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "I'm dying, Sloane," he said, the words plain, stripped of pretense. "And I have no heir. I need you, one last time." The air stilled, the confession hanging between them like a held breath. Sloane froze, her fingers tightening on the armrest, the wood cool under her palm. Dying. The word was a blade, cutting through the resentment she'd carried, exposing the raw edges of a love she'd buried. Her mind flashed to their last fight. His promises of soon, her pleas for now, the silence that followed when he chose his empire over her. She saw him young again, vibrant, his ambition a fire that warmed her until it burned. Now that fire was gone, replaced by a man who looked smaller, his shoulders curved inward, as if shielding what little time remained. Disbelief surged, tangled with a sadness she didn't want to feel. How dare he ask this of her after all these years? To need her now when he hadn't then. Her pride bristled, urging her to stand, to leave, to let him face his end alone. But her eyes caught the tremor in his hands, the way his jaw tightened as he waited, and she couldn't move. Memories flooded in. His rare vulnerability when he'd read her poetry, stumbling over the words. The way he'd held her after her father's death, silent but present. That man was still here, somewhere, beneath the ruin of time. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The silence stretched, heavier than his confession, filled with the weight of their shared past and the audacity of his request. The clock ticked on, its sound a distant echo of the life slipping from him. Sloane's gaze drifted to the window, where the fields blurred into dusk, and she felt the collision of then and now. A love lost, a wound reopened, and a question she wasn't ready to answer. The silence in the sitting room was a living thing, coiling around Sloane Whitmore like fog, heavy with the echo of Beckett Langston's words. "I'm dying, Sloane, and I have no heir. I need you one last time." The air seemed to pause, the faint crackle of the fire and the distant tick of the grandfather clock swallowed by the weight of his request. She sat rigid in the armchair, her fingers still gripping the armrest, the wood's grain pressing into her palm as if anchoring her to a world that no longer made sense. Outside, the dusk deepened, the estate's fields blurring into a muted wash of gray and gold, as if the earth itself held its breath for her response. Sloane's mind churned, layers of emotion peeling back like pages in a book she tried to forget. Disbelief came first, sharp and cold. How could he ask this, after years of silence, after walking away when she'd begged him to stay? Anger followed, a slow burn in her chest, not loud but deep, rooted in the betrayal of a love she'd buried. Yet beneath it, unbidden, was a flicker of heartbreak, a memory of the man who'd once held her hand on a windswept cliff, his rare smile brighter than the sea below. And there, in the quietest corner of her heart, was something softer, empathy, unwanted but undeniable, for the pale, fragile man before her, his eyes carrying a fear he couldn't voice. Beckett didn't push. He sat across from her on the worn sofa, his posture straight but brittle, like a man holding himself together by will alone. His voice, when he spoke again, was calm, almost businesslike, but the tremor beneath it betrayed him. "I've thought this through," he said, his words measured, as if rehearsed to keep emotion at bay. "It's not a whim." He reached for a folder on the table between them, its edges crisp, the paper heavy with intent. He slid it toward her, the soft scrape of it against the wood louder than it should have been. "Everything's here. For you. For the child." Sloane's gaze dropped to the folder, its plain cover unmarked but heavy with implication. She didn't move to take it, not yet. Her hands rested in her lap, one thumb brushing against the other, a small gesture to steady the tremor she felt rising. She was not a woman who cried easily. Years of running her bookshop, of building a life from the ashes of their love, had taught her to hold herself together. But his words pierced the walls she'd built, each one a needle threading through the scars he'd left behind. A child. His heir. The audacity of it, the presumption, stirred a question she couldn't voice. Was this about guilt, a final attempt to erase his mistakes, or was it control, his need to shape the world even as he left it? He watched her, his eyes steady but hollow, the lines of his face deeper in the lamplight. "It's not about obligation," he said, as if sensing her thoughts. "You'd be protected. The trust, it's for you, for them. The Langston Foundation would ensure everything." His voice caught slightly, and he looked away, toward the window where the lake beyond the fields shimmered faintly, its surface catching the last of the light. "I know what I'm asking is impossible, but I have nothing else left." The word nothing hung between them, raw and unadorned. Sloane reached for the folder, her movements slow, deliberate, as if touching it might commit her to something she wasn't ready to face. The paper was cool under her fingers, the faint smell of ink rising as she opened it. Pages of legalese stared back, terms drafted by his personal counsel, clinical in their precision. Trust funds, inheritance clauses, provisions for a child who didn't exist. It was a transaction, a deal structured with the same meticulous care he'd once applied to his empire of energy firms and shipping routes. Yet beneath the cold language was a plea, a man's desperate bid to leave something human behind, something more than assets and acquisitions. She read in silence, her eyes scanning the lines without truly absorbing them. Her hands trembled once, then steadied as she pressed them flat against the pages. The question burned in her mind. Did he even know what love meant anymore? Or was this just another contract, a way to bind her to his legacy? She remembered the nights they'd spent in her tiny apartment, her reading poetry while he listened, his ambitions softened by her presence. That man had known love, or at least its edges, but the one before her now seemed carved from fear, his heart's faltering rhythm driving him to grasp at what he'd lost. The room felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of their history. The fire's glow cast shadows across the oak floor, flickering like memories she couldn't escape. She saw him young again, laughing as they stumbled through a rain-soaked park, his arm around her like a promise he couldn't keep. She saw the day he left, his suitcase by the door, his eyes avoiding hers as he spoke of deals that couldn't wait. The folder in her hands felt like an extension of that moment, a choice presented in the language of control, not connection. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "Why me?" she asked, her voice low, steady, but laced with a challenge. "After all this time, why me?" Beckett's jaw tightened, his fingers clasping tighter in his lap. "Because you were the only one who ever saw me," he said, his voice quieter now, almost breaking. "Not the empire, not the name. Just me." He paused, his eyes dropping to the folder, as if it could shield him from the vulnerability of his words. "I don't expect forgiveness. I need to know there's something of me that isn't ash when I'm gone." The confession landed softly, but it carried the weight of years. Sloane closed the folder, the sound sharp in the quiet room. She didn't speak, didn't trust herself to. Her mind was a storm. Anger at his presumption, heartbreak for the man he'd become, and that persistent ache, the part of her that still remembered the warmth of his hand in hers. She stood, needing distance, and crossed to the window. The lake outside was still, its surface a mirror for the darkening sky. She saw him reflected in the glass. Not the pale figure on the sofa, but the younger Beckett, the one who'd promised her forever before choosing power instead. The clock ticked on, its rhythm a faint echo of the time slipping away from them both. She turned back to him, the folder still in her hand, unopened again. "I need time," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. It's too much." She set the folder on the table, its edges aligned with the wood, a small act of control in a moment that felt anything but. Beckett nodded, his face unreadable, but his eyes heavy with something unspoken. He didn't move, didn't press, as if he knew pushing would break whatever fragile thread connected them. The fire crackled, the only sound breaking the silence that settled over them again. Thicker now, filled with the weight of what he'd asked and what she couldn't yet answer. Sloane's gaze lingered on the lake, its stillness a contrast to the chaos in her chest. She wanted to hate him, to walk away and let his regrets consume him alone. But that ache persisted, a memory of the man who'd once made her feel alive, who'd listened to her read poetry in a voice that stumbled but tried. Despite the years, despite the pain, something in her still remembered him. Not the empire, not the contract, but the man who'd loved her before he lost himself. The room held its breath, the unsigned folder a silent question, and in that moment, the past and present collided, leaving her suspended between refusal and the faint, dangerous pull of what might have been. The silence in the sitting room clung to Sloane Whitmore like damp cloth, heavy with the weight of the unsigned folder on the table before her. Its edges, sharp and untouched, seemed to pulse with the question she couldn't answer. Not yet. The fire's embers glowed faintly, casting trembling shadows across the oak floor, and beyond the window, the lake reflected a sliver of moon, its light fractured on the water's surface. The grandfather clocks ticking echoed down the corridor, a faint pulse that seemed to mock the faltering rhythm of Beckett Langston's heart. Sloane stood by the window, her fingers brushing the cool glass, her breath fogging it briefly before it cleared. The world outside was quiet, the wind humming softly through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth into the night. Her mind was a battlefield, reason clashing with the raw ache of memory. Agreeing to his request, bearing the child of a dying man who'd once shattered her, felt like a betrayal of the life she'd built. The bookshop walls lined with poetry, the evenings spent alone but whole. Yet beneath the hurt, a stubborn ember glowed. The memory of his warmth, the way his laughter had once filled a room, the tenderness he'd shown before ambition carved him into someone else. She saw him as he was then, his eyes bright with possibility, his hands steady in hers as they walked the cliffside trails near her old apartment. The scent of his cologne, cedar and something sharper, like sea air, lingered in her senses, as if the past could seep through time and touch her now. Beckett sat across the room, his silhouette barely moving, his silence louder than words. He didn't press, didn't plead, his frailty a quiet presence that filled the space between them. She could feel his gaze, not demanding but waiting, as if he knew the gravity of what he'd asked might crush them both. The folder, with its clinical promises of trusts and legacies, felt like a wall, his attempt to control the uncontrollable, to leave something behind when his heart gave out. But it wasn't the contract that held her here. It was the man she'd loved, the one who'd promised forever before choosing power over her, and the man he was now, stripped bare by mortality. She turned from the window, her scarf still knotted loosely at her neck, and met his eyes. "I can't decide tonight," she said, her voice steady but soft, like a stone dropped into still water. "I need space." He nodded, his face unreadable but his hands trembling slightly as they rested on his knees. He rose, slower than she remembered, and gestured toward the hall. "The east wing is yours," he said, As long as you need. She followed him through the darkened corridor, the clock's ticking growing louder, its rhythm a faint echo of the time slipping away. The east wing was a world apart, its rooms sparse but warm, with heavy curtains and a bed draped in faded linen. A single window overlooked the lake, its surface now a mirror of stars scattered across the night. Beckett left her there, his footsteps retreating, and the door clicked shut with a finality that made her chest tighten. She didn't unpack, didn't sit. Instead, she crossed to the window, the floor creaking under her boots, and stared out at the water. Years ago, they'd stood by that lake, their laughter mingling with the wind, his arm around her as if nothing could break them. The memory was vivid. The way his breath had warmed her cheek, the promise in his voice when he spoke of a future they'd never share. Now, the lake was silent, its stillness a mirror to the emptiness she felt. Sleep wouldn't come. She lay on the bed, the mattress firm beneath her, but her mind refused to settle. Images drifted through her, his hand brushing hers as they paged through a book of Neruda's poems. The way he'd pause to listen when she spoke, truly listen, before the world pulled him away. She rose, restless, and returned to the window, the moon's light casting her shadow across the floor. The lake shimmered, and she could almost hear their old laughter, faint as a ghost, carried on the wind. What did it mean to give him this, to carry his child, to tie herself to a man who'd left her behind? Reason told her to walk away, to protect the life she'd built. But emotion, that traitor, whispered of the man who'd once been hers, the one who stood now on the edge of oblivion, reaching for her in desperation. A sound broke her thoughts, soft footsteps in the hall, hesitant, almost inaudible. She froze, her breath catching, knowing it was him before the knock came. It was barely a tap, uncertain, as if he wasn't sure he had the right to disturb her. She crossed the room, her heart pounding, and opened the door. Beckett stood there, frilier than before, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his eyes shadowed in the dim light. He wasn't the titan who'd built empires, not the man who'd walked away from her. He was just Beckett, stripped of arrogance, his shoulders curved as if carrying the weight of his own end. She didn't speak, didn't need to. She stepped aside, letting him in, the act inevitable but heavy with sorrow. The room seemed to shrink around them, the air thick with the history they couldn't escape. He didn't reach for her, not at first. They stood close, the space between them charged with a quiet desperation. Not lust but something deeper. A need to find peace in the wreckage of what they'd lost. When he finally touched her, his hand grazing her arm, it was tentative, a question rather than a claim. She didn't pull away. Their closeness was not passion but a kind of surrender, a moment where time paused, and they were just two people clinging to what might have been. The lake outside watched, its surface unmoving, as they found solace in each other's presence, knowing it might be the last time. By morning, the room was cold, the fire in the hearth long dead. Sloane woke alone, the sheets tangled, the air heavy with the weight of what had happened. The dawn broke softly, its light spilling across the lake, turning it to molten silver. Beckett was gone, his absence a presence in itself. On the bedside table, a single sheet of paper waited, folded once, his handwriting visible even from where she stood. She didn't touch it, not yet. Her fingers brushed the edge of the bed, steadying herself as she crossed to the window. The world outside was waking, the trees swaying gently, but inside her, something had shifted, irreversible, unspoken, a choice made in the quiet of the night. She stood there, watching the dawn paint the lake in hues of gold and gray, her breath fogging the glass. The note lay behind her, a question she wasn't ready to answer, but the weight of the night lingered, a reminder of the man she'd loved and the man who'd come to her, broken and human at last. The silence held, soft but powerful, as she faced the morning, knowing nothing would ever be the same. Morning light spilled into the east wing of Beckett Langston's estate, painting the room in hues of pale gold and silver, the lake outside shimmering like a memory caught in glass. Sloane Whitmore woke to an empty bed, the sheets beside her cool and undisturbed, as if the night before had been a dream that left no trace. The air was colder now, quieter, a stillness that seemed to seep into her bones. She lay still for a moment, her breath shallow, a numbness settling over her like frost on the windowpane. She wasn't crying. Tears had never been her way, but the weight of what had happened pressed against her chest, heavy and irreversible. A choice made in the dark that now faced the light. She moved slowly, deliberately, as if each action might shatter the fragile silence. Her feet found the floor, the oak cool beneath her soles, and she stood, her scarf draped loosely over the chair where she'd left it. The room felt larger without him, its sparse furnishings, a wooden dresser, a faded rug, the heavy curtains, standing as silent witnesses to the night. Her eyes drifted to the bedside table, where a single folded sheet of paper waited, Beckett's handwriting unmistakable in its careful, slanted lines. Her fingers hesitated, hovering over it, the paper's edges soft from handling. She wasn't ready to read it, not yet, but its presence pulled at her. A tether to the man who'd come to her door, frail and human, and left before dawn. She sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress dipping slightly, and picked up the note. The paper was heavy, the kind he'd always used, its faint scent of ink stirring a memory of letters they'd exchanged years ago, when love was still a language they both spoke. She unfolded it slowly, the creases yielding with a soft rustle, and her eyes traced the words he'd left behind. They were brief, unadorned, but they struck like a stone dropped into still water. A confession that this, all of it, was never just about an heir, never just about legacy. It was about her, about them, about the man he might have been if time hadn't hardened him. The words hurt, sharp and raw, cutting through the numbness to find the ache she'd buried. But they comforted too, a quiet acknowledgement that he'd seen her, even now, as more than a means to an end. Sloane set the note down, her hand steady but her heart unsteady, caught between the pain of his absence and the strange solace of his honesty. She didn't cry, didn't call out for him. The silence was enough, wrapping around her like the morning mist outside. She looked to the window, where the lake glowed under the rising sun, its surface undisturbed except for a single ripple spreading outward, faint and fleeting. She remembered standing there with him years ago, their laughter mingling with the wind, his arm around her as they watched the water catch the light. Now he was gone again, just as he'd left her then. But this time the absence felt final, a door closed that might never reopen. The estate was quiet as she gathered her things. Her bag, small and practical, sat by the door, its contents unchanged except for the weight of the note she slipped inside. She moved through the room with care, folding her scarf, smoothing the bed, as if leaving no trace could preserve the moment. The grandfather clock in the corridor ticked on, its rhythm a faint echo of the time slipping away, and she paused to listen, the sound grounding her in the stillness. She didn't look for him, didn't expect to find him waiting. She'd heard the distant hum of a private jet before dawn, its roar fading into the night, carrying him away as it always had. The hall was empty as she descended the stairs, her boots soft on the oak, the air thick with the must of old books and the faint scent of ash from the dead fire. The sitting room, where they'd faced each other last night, was untouched, the folder still on the table, its edges catching the light. She didn't touch it, didn't need to. Its terms, trusts, legacies, a future she couldn't yet imagine, were secondary to the note in her bag, its words a heavier burden. She stepped outside, the gravel crunching under her shoes, the sound sharp in the morning's quiet. The sun was high now, its warmth weak against the autumn chill, and a driver waited by a plain sedan, his face neutral, saying nothing as he opened the door. Sloane slid into the back seat, her bag beside her, the note's weight a presence she could feel through the leather. The estate receded as the car pulled away, its stone walls fading into the fields, the lake a glimmer in the distance. She watched it shrink in the side mirror, a piece of herself left behind in that house, in the room where they'd found each other one last time. The driver didn't speak, and she was grateful for the silence, letting it wrap around her as the countryside gave way to the city's edges. The world felt different now, smaller, quieter, as if it had shifted to match the stillness inside her. Back in her coastal town, the bookshop waited, its shelves lined with poetry and history, a life she'd built from the ruins of their love. She unlocked the door, the bell jingling softly, and stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and coffee grounding her. But the space felt unfamiliar, the silence following her from the estate, settling into the corners of the room. She set her bag on the counter, the note still inside, unopened since she'd read it. She didn't need to see it again. Its words were etched in her mind, a confession that both wounded and held her. She moved to the window, where the sea rolled in, gray and restless, its rhythm a contrast to the lake's stillness. Her reflection stared back, older now, silver threading her dark hair, but the woman she saw was caught between past and present. She thought of Beckett. Not the man who'd left her, not the empire builder, but the one who'd stood at her door last night, stripped of pretense, his eyes pleading for something he couldn't name. She didn't know if she'd see him again, didn't know if she wanted to. The note, tucked away in her bag, was a question she couldn't answer, a bridge between the life she'd chosen and the one she'd lost. Sloane stood there, the shop quiet around her, the world outside moving on without pause. The numbness lingered, but beneath it was a shift, subtle but undeniable. A feeling that something inside her had changed forever. The sea churned, the bell above the door silent, and she let the moment hold her, suspended in the aftermath of his absence, knowing the note's weight would follow her wherever she went. The bell above the bookshop door jingled as Sloane Whitmore stepped back into her world, the sound sharp but fleeting, swallowed by the silence she carried from Beckett Langston's estate. Her bag, heavy with the folded note she hadn't touched since reading it, rested against her hip, its weight a constant reminder of the night that had changed her. The shop was unchanged, shelves lined with poetry and history, the air thick with the scent of old paper and coffee, but it felt foreign, as if the walls had shifted in her absence. She moved slowly, her boots soft on the worn floor, and set the bag on the counter, her fingers lingering on its strap. The sea outside churned, gray and restless, but she didn't look at it. Her gaze drifted inward, caught in the ache she couldn't name, a mix of loss and something softer, something that felt like memory but heavier. Her apartment, a small townhouse at the edge of the coastal town, welcomed her with the same quiet she'd left behind. The stairs creaked as she climbed, the banister smooth under her hand, and the living room greeted her with its familiar clutter. Books stacked unevenly, a half-finished mug of tea on the table, a blanket draped over the arm of a faded sofa. She dropped her bag by the door, the note inside a silent presence, and sank into the sofa, her body heavier than it should have been. The silence followed her here, settling into the corners of the room, thicker than the evening light filtering through the curtains. She didn't turn on the lamp. The dusk was enough, its muted glow softening the edges of a world that no longer fit. Days blurred into weeks, each one quieter than the last. Sloane moved through her routine, opening the shop, shelving books, nodding at customers. But her movements were slower, as if weighed down by an unseen force. She avoided calls, letting her phone buzz unanswered on the counter, the voices of friends distant and unnecessary. Meals went untouched, plates of toast or soup left to cool as she stared out the window, her thoughts drifting to the lake at the estate, to the way Beckett's hand had grazed her arm, tentative and desperate. Passing a store window one morning, she paused, her reflection caught beside a display of children's clothes, tiny sweaters, soft blues and yellows, a world she'd never imagined. Her gaze lingered, not with longing but with a quiet confusion, as if her body knew something her mind hadn't yet grasped. She felt off, not sick but unsteady, a fatigue that settled into her bones like damp weather. Mornings found her lingering in bed, the weight of her limbs pulling her back to sleep, and her focus slipped, pages of invoices blurring under her eyes. It wasn't worry that drove her to the physician, but a nagging sense that something had shifted, something she couldn't ignore. The clinic was small, tucked between a bakery and a hardware store, its waiting room smelling of antiseptic and old magazines. Sloane sat, her hands folded in her lap, the hum of a fluorescent light overhead blending with the faint whir of machinery from the exam room. The doctor, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, moved with a gentle efficiency, her questions soft but precise. Sloane answered mechanically, her voice steady, but her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, where the note still rested, unread since that morning. The doctor's expression shifted as she reviewed the results. A pause so brief it might have gone unnoticed, but Sloane caught it. The way her lips pressed together, the slight tilt of her head. "Sloane," she said, her voice calm but weighted. "You're pregnant." The words landed softly, like leaves falling on still water, and the room seemed to contract, the hum of machinery fading into a profound stillness. Sloane didn't move, didn't gasp. Her breath came slow, heavy, as if testing the air for truth. Pregnant. The word echoed, carrying the memory of Beckett's touch, the desperation of that night, the note's confession that it was never just about an heir. He was gone, but he was here, living inside her now, a life she hadn't chosen but couldn't unchoose. She left the clinic without speaking, the doctor's offer of pamphlets and follow-ups a distant hum. The town felt quieter as she walked, the sea's rhythm muted, the streets empty despite the midday bustle. Back in her apartment, she sat at the kitchen table, the note unfolded before her, its words unchanged but heavier now. She didn't cry, didn't call anyone. Not her friends, not the press that had begun to whisper about Beckett's sudden absence from his companies. Rumors swirling like leaves in the wind. She folded the note again, slipping it into her bag, and let the silence hold her. A cocoon that both hurt and protected. Weeks passed, and Sloane began to rearrange her life, not with urgency but with a quiet resolve. The bookshop could be managed remotely, a trusted friend stepping in to handle the daily tasks. She didn't tell anyone why, didn't speak of the life growing inside her. The tabloids grew louder, speculating about Beckett's health, his empire's future, but she avoided their headlines, their questions. Her decision was hers alone, sacred in its solitude, a choice to carry this life not as a scandal or a secret but as something hers, something human. She left the townhouse behind, its walls too small for the change she felt. The Langston vineyards up north called to her, their rolling hills a place of peace she'd once visited with Beckett, long before ambition pulled him away. She found a small cottage there, its stone walls weathered but warm, surrounded by rows of vines heavy with grapes, their leaves turning gold in the late autumn light. The move was quiet, her belongings packed in a few boxes, the note tucked safely in her bag. The cottage smelled of rain on soil, its windows overlooking hills that stretched into the horizon, calm and green. Mornings were soft here, the air cool, the silence no longer a weight but a companion. Sloane settled into the rhythm of the place, her days filled with small tasks. Unpacking books, arranging a desk by the window, walking the paths between the vines. Her fatigue lingered, but it was different now, a sign of the life she carried, a reminder of the night that had bound her to Beckett one last time. She didn't reach out to him, didn't know if he was still in the country or if his jet had carried him to some distant shore. The silence between them was a choice, hers as much as his, and she protected it, shielding the fragile thing growing inside her. One morning, as the sun rose over the vineyards, Sloane stood at the cottage window, the glass cool against her palm. The hills glowed, their curves soft under the dawn's light, and she felt a flutter, faint but real, beneath her hand as it rested lightly over her stomach. The silence that had followed her from the estate, from the townhouse, from that night had shifted. It wasn't pain anymore, not absence. It was protection, a quiet vow to nurture what she carried, to give it a life free of the shadows that had haunted Beckett's. The vines swayed gently outside, the world calm and green, and Sloane stood there, her breath steady, the ache inside her now a promise she would keep. The vineyard cottage glowed softly under the morning sun, its stone walls warmed by light that spilled across the rolling hills, where rows of vines stretched like quiet sentinels. Sloane Whitmore stood at the window, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, the faint curve of her pregnancy a secret she carried with a fragile peace. Months had passed since she'd left the city, Her life now a rhythm of early mornings, the scent of damp soil, and the scratch of her pen on paper as she wrote letters to Beckett she never mailed. The world felt calm, muted, as if it had learned to breathe in time with her. She tended to small plants on the windowsill, lavender and rosemary, their leaves soft under her fingers, and walked the vineyard paths at dawn, the crunch of gravel under her boots a steady counterpoint to the baby's gentle movements within her. Memories of Beckett returned like soft echoes. His tentative smile by the lake, the warmth of his hand before ambition stole him away. She held them carefully, not with longing but with a quiet acceptance, as if they were pages in a book she'd read but no longer needed to open. Her days were sacred, deliberate. She woke with the sun, brewed tea in a chipped mug, and sat at the wooden table by the window, writing words she'd never send. "You'd love the vines, Beck. They're stubborn like you were." The letters piled up in a drawer, their ink a map of her thoughts, tracing the man he'd been and the one who'd left her with a note that promised more than an heir. The silence of the cottage was her companion, not heavy but protective, wrapping around her and the life growing inside her. She avoided the world beyond the hills, ignoring the buzz of her phone, the newspapers left at the general store. Her life was here, in the green and gold of the vineyard, where time felt kinder, slower. Then came the first crack, small but sharp, like a stone nicking glass. She was scrolling on her tablet one evening, the cottage dark except for the glow of the screen, when a headline caught her eye. A news article, buried in a financial outlet's feed. Langston returns to spotlight at Investor Summit. The photo loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, revealing Beckett, paler than she remembered, but upright, his suit sharp, his smile tight. Beside him was a woman, elegant and poised, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her laughter caught mid-frame. The caption was a blade. Beckett Langston with rumored fiancée, Clara Veron, at private investor event. Sloane's breath stopped, the oxygen leaving the room as if sucked out by the image. She didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, the world around her fading. The hum of the wind through the vines, the creak of the cottage settling, all swallowed by a silence that pressed against her chest. Disbelief came first, cold and sharp, a refusal to accept what she saw. Beckett with another woman, after everything, the night in the East Wing, the note, the life she now carried. Her mind whispered, "It's not true," clinging to the man who'd stood at her door, stripped of arrogance, pleading for her in his quiet way. But the photo stared back, undeniable, and numbness followed, a heavy fog that dulled her senses. She set the tablet down, her hands steady but her pulse uneven, and sat in the dark, the vineyard outside invisible now, the moon hidden behind clouds. Grief came slowly, not a storm but a tide, rising in her chest as she remembered his touch, the desperation that had bound them that night, the promise in his note that it was never just about an heir. Had he rewritten his story already, leaving her behind again, this time with a child he didn't know? Days passed, and the rumors multiplied, each one a splinter under her skin. Headlines bloomed, Langston expands energy holdings, mystery woman at Langston's side. His name inescapable, even in her secluded world. She scrolled through them late at night, the tablet's light harsh against her eyes, her tea growing cold, her meals untouched. The woman, Clara, appeared again and again, her elegance a contrast to Sloane's quiet life, her presence a reminder that the world moved on while Sloane stood still. She didn't call him, didn't write. Restraint held her together, a thread stretched thin but unbroken. She watched from a distance, her heart caught between the man she'd loved and the one who seemed to have forgotten her. The vineyard's peace felt fragile now, its silence no longer a refuge but a mirror to her isolation. Then came the real betrayal, colder than any photograph. A letter arrived, delivered to the cottage by a courier who didn't meet her eyes. It was sealed in crisp, heavy paper, the kind used for official matters, stamped with the logo of a law firm she recognized, Beckett's Counsel. She opened it at the kitchen table, the vineyard dark outside, the wind rattling the windows. The words were clinical, professional, offering a confidential settlement for any potential reputational concerns. The language was careful, devoid of warmth, but the signature at the bottom was his Beckett Langston, inked in his unmistakable hand. Sloane's breath caught, her fingers tightening around the paper until it trembled. He knew. The realization was a knife, not sharp but heavy, cutting through the fog of disbelief. He knew she was pregnant, knew what they'd created that night, and this cold, calculated offer was his response. Tears came then, not a flood but a slow burn, tracing her cheeks as she stared at the letter. The baby kicked, a sudden flutter against her ribs, and the contrast broke something inside her. She pressed a hand to her stomach, grounding herself in the life that was hers, not his, not theirs. The wind howled outside, carrying the scent of rain and soil, and she let the tears fall, not for him but for the woman she'd been, the one who'd believed in his promises. The grief wasn't loud. It was suffocating, a quiet unraveling of the piece she'd built. She didn't scream, didn't tear the letter. She folded it carefully, tucking it into the drawer with her unsent letters, and sat in the dark, the baby's movements a reminder that she wasn't alone, not entirely. Days later, the headlines continued, but Sloane stopped reading them. The world could have Beckett's name, his empire, his rumored fiancé. She had this, the cottage, the vines, the life growing inside her. The betrayal had shifted something, turning her heartbreak into resolve. A quiet fire that burned beneath her skin. She wouldn't let them erase her, wouldn't let his lawyers reduce her child to a clause in a contract. The silence that had once hurt now felt like armor, a vow to protect what was hers. She stood at the window one evening, the vineyard glowing under a soft dusk, the hills calm and green. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach, the baby's kick a steady pulse against her palm. The wind rose outside, rustling the vines, and she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "You wanted silence, Beckett. You'll have it, but not the way you think." The words were a promise, not to him but to herself, to the child who would know her strength, not his shadows. The cottage held her, its silence no longer a wound but a shield, and she stood there, the world outside calm and green, her resolve a quiet force that would carry her forward. The dim glow of a single lamp bathed Sloane Whitmore's cottage, casting soft shadows across the stone walls as the autumn evening deepened. The letter from Beckett Langston's lawyers lay on the wooden table, its edges worn from being folded, unfolded, folded again. A silent testament to the weeks that had passed since its arrival. Outside, the vineyard vines stood taller, their leaves curling gold under the weight of the season, the air sharp with the scent of damp soil and fading light. Sloane moved through her days with a deliberate rhythm, her steps slower now, her meals softer, oats, apples, warm tea, to steady the life growing inside her. The hatred she'd once felt for Beckett had dissolved, replaced by an exhaustion that made the silence heavy, a presence that lingered in every corner of her small, quiet home. She sat at the table, a book open but unread, her fingers tracing the spine as the wind hummed through the vines outside. The world beyond the cottage felt distant, its rumors of Beckett's empire and his rumored fiancé fading into irrelevance. She hadn't seen him, didn't expect to. The note she carried in her bag, his confession that it was never just about an heir, was enough to anchor her to the past without pulling her back. But then, as the sky darkened to a bruised purple, a sound broke the stillness. The low hum of tires on gravel, not loud but sharp, like a stone dropped into still water. She looked up, her breath catching, and saw the faint glow of headlights through the window. A black sedan stopped at the gate, its engine quieting as the door opened. No guards, no entourage, just him. Beckett stepped out, his silhouette thinner than she remembered, his frame fragile, as if the sickness had finally claimed the strength he'd once wielded like armor. His coat hung loose, his steps uneven on the gravel path, but there was a calmness in his posture, a quiet resolve that softened the edges of his frailty. Sloane didn't move, didn't rush to the door. She stood in the doorway, her hand resting on the frame, watching him approach. His face was pale, the lines deeper, but his eyes held a clarity she hadn't seen before, as if he'd made peace with the time he had left. When their gazes met, the air seemed to still, the weight of their history filling the space between them. Everything that needed to be said already lived in the silence. He paused at the threshold, his breath shallow. "I wasn't supposed to come," he said, his voice faint, breaking slightly on the last word. Sloane's eyes held his, steady and unyielding. "Then why are you here?" He looked down, his hands trembling at his sides. "Because I wanted to see what peace looks like." The words hung there, simple but heavy, and she stepped aside, letting him in. The cottage felt smaller with him inside, the air thick with the ghosts of their past. The night in the East Wing, the morning he'd left, the months of unspoken words. He sank onto the couch, too weak to remove his coat, its dark fabric pooling around him like a shadow. Sloane stood across from him, her arms crossed, not out of anger but to hold herself together. The wall clock ticked, its rhythm steady where his wasn't, and the faint sound of wind rustled the vines outside, carrying the scent of rain. His eyes fell on the letter on the table, its creased edges unmistakable. He froze, recognition flickering across his face, but he didn't reach for it, didn't defend the cold words it held. Instead, he leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly, and whispered, "I told them to protect you. I didn't know they'd erase you." His voice broke, a crack that let the truth spill out, raw and unguarded. "I didn't know." Sloane didn't respond, not at first. She watched him, the man who'd built empires now reduced to this frail human, sitting in her quiet cottage like a stranger who belonged. The tension in the room softened, not with words but with the weight of what they'd shared, what they'd lost. Forgiveness crept in, not spoken but felt, a quiet shift that eased the air between them. She moved closer, her steps slow, and sat beside him, the couch creaking under their shared weight. The clock ticked on, its sound blending with their breathing, a rhythm that felt almost synchronized, as if time had paused to let them be. She reached for his hand, his skin cool and trembling, and guided it to her stomach. The movement was small, deliberate, but it carried the weight of everything they hadn't said. The baby kicked, a faint flutter against his palm, and Beckett froze, his breath catching. His eyes closed, and a single tear traced the line of his cheek, catching the lamplight. "I wanted my legacy to be an empire," he murmured, his voice barely audible, breaking on the edges. "I was wrong. My legacy is here." The words settled into the room, heavy and true, echoing in the silence that followed. Sloane didn't speak, didn't need to. Her hand stayed over his, the baby's movement a bridge between them, a life that was both theirs and hers alone. The clock's ticking filled the space, steady and unyielding, and outside, the wind grew stronger, carrying the first drops of rain against the windows. They sat there, not moving, the moment stretching into something sacred, something that held the weight of their past and the fragility of now. He stayed that night, too tired to move, too fragile to fight the sleep that pulled at him. Sloane helped him settle on the couch, draping a blanket over him, its edges frayed from years of use. He didn't protest, his eyes heavy, his breath shallow but steady. She stood in the doorway to her bedroom, watching him, unsure if she was seeing him rest or fade. His chest rose and fell, slow and uneven, one hand resting where their child grew, as if anchoring himself to the life he'd never know. The sight was both comfort and ache, a reminder of the man he'd been and the one he'd become. She turned off the lamp, the room falling into darkness except for the faint glow of moonlight through the window. Rain pattered softly outside, a gentle rhythm that matched the quiet in her heart. Peace had replaced love, not because the love was gone but because it had finally stopped hurting. She whispered into the dark, her voice soft, barely audible. "You found your peace too late, Beckett, but at least you found it." The cottage held its breath, the rain a faint murmur against the glass. Beckett slept, his hands still resting on the promise of their child, and Sloane stood there, the silence no longer heavy but complete, a space where truth lived without words. The vines swayed outside, the night calm and unending, and she let the moment hold her, knowing it was enough. The living room of Sloane Whitmore's Vineyard Cottage was steeped in the faint scent of rain and candle wax, the air heavy with the quiet of a night that held its breath. Beckett Langston lay asleep on the couch, his breathing uneven but peaceful, a rhythm that seemed to teeter on the edge of fragility. Sloane sat across from him, wrapped in a wool blanket, its edges frayed from years of use. She watched him the way one might watch a setting sun, knowing it wouldn't rise again, yet grateful for the warmth it left behind. His hand rested where their child grew, fingers curled slightly, as if anchoring himself to the life he'd never know. The silence spoke louder than words, filling the space between them with a tenderness that needed no voice. She didn't move, didn't disturb him, her eyes tracing the lines of his face, softer now in sleep, stripped of the ambition that had once defined him. The rain pattered softly against the windows, a gentle cadence that matched the ticking of the wall clock. Sloane's breath was slow, deliberate, as if she could hold time still by willing it so. She didn't know this was his last night, didn't sense the finality in the way his chest rose and fell, but something in her chest tightened, a quiet ache that felt like goodbye. She pulled the blanket closer, the wool rough against her skin, and let the silence wrap around them. A cocoon for two people who'd found peace too late. The vines outside swayed in the wind, their shadows flickering across the floor, and she sat there, watching him, memorizing the man he'd become in these final moments. Human, frail, hers again in a way that didn't hurt. Morning came softly, gold light filtering through the curtains, painting the room in hues of amber and warmth. Sloane woke in her chair, her neck stiff, the blanket pooled at her feet. The cottage was still, too still, a perfection that felt wrong, like a note held too long. She stood, her steps slow, and crossed to the couch. "Beckett," she said, her voice soft, barely a whisper. No answer. She called again, louder this time, her hand reaching for his shoulder. His skin was cold under her fingers, his body still, his hand unmoving where it rested on the promise of their child. The silence was absolute now, broken only by the faint hum of the wind outside. No tears came, no scream, just a long, broken stillness that settled into her bones. She knelt beside him, her hand lingering on his, the coldness of his fingers a contrast to the warmth she carried inside her. Grief unfolded gently, not a storm but a tide, washing over her in waves of quiet heartbreak. She'd known this day would come, had felt its shadow in every uneven breath, but its arrival was softer than she'd imagined, a departure that left her both empty and full. "You kept your promise, Beckett," she whispered, her voice steady but raw. "You found your peace." The words hung in the air, a farewell spoken to the silence, and she stayed there, her hand over his, until the light grew stronger, the room no longer theirs but hers alone. Weeks later, the Langston Foundation released a statement, its words clipped and formal. Beckett Langston passed peacefully in his home. The media swirled, headlines mourning the titan who'd shaped cities and seas, investors speculating on the future of his empire. Sloane remained unseen, a ghost in their narrative, her name absent from the stories that filled the papers. She didn't attend the memorial, didn't answer the calls that came from curious reporters. She chose privacy, not out of fear but because she understood what he'd meant by silence. A space where truth could live without the world's noise. The cottage became her sanctuary, the vines her witnesses. As she carried their child through the autumn and into winter, her life measured in the quiet rhythm of her days. Months passed, and the seasons turned. A year later, Sloane stood in a new building, its walls modern but unassuming, the air smelling of fresh paint and possibility. Her son, barely 6 months old, rested in her arms, his tiny hand curled around her finger. The sign above the entrance read, "The Sloane Project, A. Langston Foundation Initiative." It was no grand monument, no towering legacy of wealth, but a humble space dedicated to underprivileged children. Scholarships, classes, a chance at the opportunities Beckett had never had time to create when he chased power. The world called it charity. Sloane called it atonement, a way to give his name a purpose beyond profit, a heartbeat beyond his own. She stood before a small crowd, Not elites or journalists, but families, children, ordinary people whose lives might change because of this place. Her speech was simple, delivered in a voice steady but soft, her son's weight grounding her. She wore soft linen, her hair tied back, no trace of the opulence that had once defined Beckett's world. He built a world that couldn't save him, she said, her words carrying across the room, clear but unadorned. But before he left, he gave me something to save others. The crowd listened, their faces open, hopeful, and she felt the weight of his absence and her son's presence in equal measure. The baby grabbed her finger, his grip strong, and a faint smile curved her lips, the first genuine one since that night, born not of joy but of peace. The ceremony ended, and the crowd dispersed, their voices fading into the hum of the building. Sloane walked to a large window overlooking the city, the same city Beckett had once ruled with contracts and ambition. Its skyline glittered faintly, but in her eyes, it was human again, softened by the life she held. Her son laughed, a small, bright sound that broke the silence, and she looked down at him, his eyes catching the light like his father's once had. The moment was hers. Theirs, a legacy not of empires but of something smaller, truer. A voice seemed to linger in the air, soft and reflective, as if narrating the end of a story long in the making. He built his world in silence. She gave it a heartbeat. The words weren't spoken, but they felt real, woven into the quiet of the room. Sloane stood there, her son in her arms, the city stretching out before her, its pulse steady and alive. The vines of the vineyard, the lake at the estate, the note in her bag. All of it was behind her now, but it lived in the boy she held, in the project she'd built, in the peace she'd found. The light faded, the city softening into dusk, and Sloane stayed by the window, her son's laughter a gentle echo in the stillness. The world moved on, but she carried its heartbeat, a quiet triumph that needed no applause. The room darkened, the moment held, and the story faded to black, complete in its silence.